Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Michaelangelo Giampaoli. Dr. Giampaoli is here to discuss his recent book on the social life of cemeteries. It's the first book completely dedicated to the analysis of cemeteries as objects and subjects of anthropological analysis. Dr. Giampaoli is currently a visiting lecturer at both DePaul University and University of Illinois, and he's teaching a course on Chicago's historic cemeteries. I'd like to start there. You're focusing in particular on 3 cemeteries. Can you walk us through that?
It's actually an interesting class because we have 4 hours each meeting, so we are able to visit, to go to these cemeteries, which are Graceland Cemetery, Oakwood Cemetery, Rose Hill Cemetery, and I also do a 4th visit in another cemetery in the city. And it's super important because most of my students never had the experience of visiting a cemetery or only visited cemeteries for a bad or sad reason.
I've been to Graceland,
Yes.
And there's just some fascinating monuments there. Can we talk about that one first? If someone should go there, what would they look for? What would they expect to see?
Graceland is just one of my favorite cemeteries, not only in Chicago, but in the United States. If you want to find a place where history, art, culture, memory, identity, nature, wildlife are available for free in a wonderful environment, Graceland is the right place you want to visit. The history of Chicago and the history of Midwest is there. You have plenty.
It's established 1860, I think, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Before that, one of the first cemeteries in Chicago was located where today's Lincoln Park, the zoo, many people visit.
Yeah.
And then people realized that that area was too beautiful to be left to the dead. So they created new cemeteries, which at the time were outside the city. Graceland was a couple of miles north of Chicago. Rose Hill was far too. Oakwoods in the south side, and Hyde Park is another beautiful place I like to visit. So really, anytime I can, I recommend people, when you visit Chicago, don't miss at least one of these 3 cemeteries. You will not regret it.
Interesting. I remember these tall statues of death, this hooded death figure at Graceland. I couldn't understand why anybody would want to put that over their grave. What was the thought process behind some of those?
Well, by the way,
these were all late, 1800s. So
yes.
Obviously there was a different artistic focus at the time, right? Kind of Art Nouveau.
Yes, absolutely. And it's worth to remember that some of the most important architects and sculptors also worked with funerary art. There is a famous sculptor I really appreciate, Lorado Taft. 2 of his most important artworks are located in Graceland Cemetery.
Okay.
One of these is a very famous monument. It's a bronze statue called the Eternal Silence. It looks dark, but when you approach the statue, when you look at the quality of the monument, you can recognize you're facing an artwork. And another one is called the Crusader. And these are just 2 of the many monuments you can find there, because Graceland also is a wealthy cemetery. This is important. People invested huge amounts of money in big mausoleums, big obelisks, and of course, big sculptures. And this is probably because these people were relevant, influent in their societies, important people in Chicago, and they also wanted to keep being important in the cities of the dead.
I think, is Louis Sullivan buried in Graceland? I remembered a story about him not having a monument and money being. Is that? Do you know anything about that?
Absolutely. Not only Louis Sullivan is part of Graceland, but Graceland is probably one of the cemeteries with the highest concentration of architects being buried there. Daniel Burnham, for example. Yeah. If you love architecture, and we know that in Chicago you must love architecture, it's a big part of the city and the history of architecture. Once again, you can take the boat and do the trip on the river. Yeah. The architectural tour is fantastic. But a visit to Graceland Cemetery is absolutely
So you should do both. Do one tour and then do the other one, right?
With one difference. Graceland is a free place. So when you visit a museum, when you do a tour, probably you have to pay. And sometimes people have no money to pay bills and pay for culture. So Graceland, Rose Hill, Oakwoods are not just cemeteries, are open-air museums and places, I will say, of democratic access to knowledge.
Yeah.
And this is important for me to remind it, that it doesn't matter how much money you have access to culture, education, and beauty in these cemeteries.
Yeah, I think one of your themes is that cemeteries are places of education, right?
They are. They really are. They educate you about death, because death is something we want to forget. Our society likes to make us forget about death, or to have death in your screen. So when you turn off the screen, you turn off death. But we know it's not true. That is part of life. So cemeteries educate you to have a better understanding of death as a part of life, to better consider your life and how lucky you are to be alive and what you want to do with your life. And also cemeteries gave you the opportunity to educate yourself. When you visit Oakwood Cemetery in the south side of Chicago, you visit the graves of Jesse Owens, one of the greatest.
Is that right?
Is there. Ida B. Wells, speaking about great women.
Yeah.
Harold Washington, the first African-American mayor of Chicago. The memory of the Civil War, the memory of social rights, and
There's a mass grave at that cemetery too, isn't there? Is that from the Civil War?
Absolutely. That's quite a controversial monument. In Oakwoods, there is what they call the Confederate Mound, which is a monument. It's a funerary monument. This is important to be remembered. It's not a monument celebrating anything. It's a monument put over the common grave where about 4,000 prisoners of war died while...
So Confederate soldiers who were prisoners in the North.
They were
died
Confederate, so they died for the wrong cause. They still are human beings, mostly in their 18, 19, 20s. I don't even know if they knew they were fighting for. Generals and politicians know. People going the first line, I don't know how much they know about war, especially when they're young.
Has there been protests over this monument or something? Or?
Well, especially over the past few years, Chicago has been talking about removing monuments. As an Italian, I know that the monuments of Christopher Columbus in the city are not there anymore.
Yeah, you're losing the battle with Columbus.
And at the same time, once again, I believe people understand that specific monument in the cemetery is not celebrating anything. It's giving a decent burial to thousands of people.
So we even have controversy in the cemetery then, don't we? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, cemeteries are places which make you think about your life. So again, when I visit Oakwoods, I can critically think about that monument, and probably we should do that, but I also reflect on the life of Ida B. Wells, Enrico Fermi, Jesse Owens, all of this in a cemetery, places many people will never visit without having a bad reason. And I always tell my students, don't wait for a sad reason in order to visit a cemetery.
Advice. Okay.
Yeah.
What about Rose Hill? Anything unique about that you want to tell us?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's one of the largest urban forests you can find in Illinois. It's huge.
Really?
Absolutely. If you like fantasy books and movies, Rose Hill, it really looks like a fantasy landscape. You have this beautiful forest with coyotes, deer, any kind of wildlife.
That's amazing, yeah.
Absolutely, and you have mausoleums, you have monuments, obelisks, landscaping. It's one of the cemeteries my students enjoy the most because it's really, really very connected to Chicago history and absolutely beautiful to explore. It's just too big. It's impossible to explore Rose Hill in one time. You probably need maybe a couple of weeks.
Yeah. Aren't trees bad for cemeteries? Are they?
Oh, no, they're good. I mean, Graceland, for example, is not just a cemetery, it's also an arboretum. It's a recognized arboretum. Cemeteries are some of the most diverse places in terms of nature and wildlife. Sometimes people have found endangered species in cemeteries. So it's super important to consider the green side of cemeteries, which is just one of the
side.
Absolutely, the living side of cemeteries. Absolutely.
And I know your initial interest here in cemeteries was Père Lachaise in Paris, right?
Yes.
Can we talk about that and compare it maybe a little bit?
Absolutely.
It's an older cemetery, I'm sure.
It is. It's the first cemetery in the modern sense of the term. The Père Lachaise was established by Napoleon in 1804. At the time, the cemeteries were located inside the churches or around the churches, and they mostly were small, crowded, and unhealthy. So the French government decided to create, again, a new kind of cemetery outside the city. And this example, the Père Lachaise, was followed by most countries, including the United States. I believe that Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston is the first example of this new kind of cemetery in the US. And then you have Arlington, and then you have Graceland, and then you have cemeteries in New York, in LA, in Los Angeles. But the Père Lachaise is really the first modern cemetery. It's also the most famous in the world. About 3 million people, most of them tourists, visit the Père Lachaise, and many of them, they visit the Père Lachaise because
they want to see Chopin, right?
I wish they wanted, but no. They want to see another great artist, which is an American guy called Jim Morrison, the singer and poet of the band The Doors.
Well, since you've taken us to Morrison's grave here, there's a lot of strange things that go on there. I understand people go and pour whiskey on the grave, and tell us what goes on there.
Well, first, we must realize that the Père Lachaise is not just a cemetery, it's a high place for transgression in Paris. The history of Père Lachaise is also a history of many forms of transgression.
Really?
Political, ideological, transgression in terms of habits, of the norms and customs of a specific time. So Jim Morrison is just one of the many ways the Père Lachaise is connected to transgression.
It sounds like a fitting place for the guy who was arrested for urinating on his audience in Florida, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And by the way, Jim Morrison's grave is probably one of the few graves in the world which is guarded by a police officers.
This amazes me because obviously the Doors were important in the music of the 1960s, but they weren't as important as Jimi Hendrix or the Beatles. And I don't know if the average person could tell you where Hendrix is buried or where Janis Joplin's buried. But everyone seems to know that Morrison's buried in Paris, and if they go to Paris, they make a point of going to his grave.
Absolutely.
Why is that? He was well known, but he wasn't that big of a deal during his lifetime, was he?
I believe that Jim Morrison being buried in Paris is part of the deal.
Yeah.
I mean, we know how important Paris is as a city, how good are the French in advertising their cities and their places. So I often wondered, if Jim Morrison was buried in another place, would he be like such a vedette, such a star? I don't think so. In any case, it's also true that many of these famous pop stars who died, they don't have a grave, a headstone. I'm pretty sure John Lennon was cremated. We have strawberry fields in Central Park, but that's not a grave. Elvis Presley, you have Graceland, the estate, but it's not free. It's a private estate. You have to pay the tour. So Jim Morrison is also an easy place to find. And again, it's a place where you're not just visiting a grave in a cemetery. You're participating in a controversial, transgressive, postmodern ritual, which is something people like to do.
There's a topic for another interview. So tell us about some of these transgressions that occurred at the cemetery in Paris.
Well, for example, one thing I learned, and this is kind of interesting, especially in the past when homosexuality could be a problem, even in Paris, the Père Lachaise was a place where homosexual people could go and meet and have activities with each other, walking without being victims of stigma or stereotype. The cemetery protecting some kind of people from the bad stereotypes. That's super interesting. Or, for example, the anarchist movement, some kind of alternative and underground political movement. They found the Père Lachaise an interesting place to gather, to meet.
Yeah.
Oscar Wilde, which is another super important figure, and
Yeah.
the Irish writer, is buried there.
Yeah.
And we know how transgressive Oscar Wilde was and how influential he still is. So there are several ways to enjoy the transgressive side of the Père Lachaise, including what people do. Tourism.
And of course, we don't consider those things transgressive today, so we can go there and
Exactly.
celebrate Wilde's life.
Well, getting drunk on Jim Morrison's grave is probably transgressive, because while I like to invite people...
Is that one of the rituals?
It is.
You have to get drunk with him? Yeah, okay.
You don't have to, but some people do.
I see, okay.
And again, while I recommend people to enjoy cemeteries, to see cemeteries as places of life, I always remember they're also, and especially, places of death. So we can go, we can visit, we can explore, we can learn, but we also must always respect not just the dead, but the people visiting their beloved ones buried in these cemeteries.
On another topic here, you also are interested in how cemeteries are designed and the rituals associated with them. Can we go into that a little bit? I notice we're talking about some rituals here at Morrison's grave, but maybe some bigger scale things that go on?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I am very much interested in religion and spirituality. And if you want to know how many religions exist or coexist in Chicago, the best place you want to visit is a cemetery.
Interesting.
Because the cemetery is the place where the many religions we have in Chicago, some religions you may know, many forms of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, but also religions you will not suspect exist in Chicago: Voodoo, Santeria, Candomblé, Spiritism. All of these religions are present in Graceland and the other cemeteries. And this is because people build monuments, put symbols in these monuments, religious symbols with specific meanings, and also because people perform rituals. It can be a funerary ritual, it can be a pilgrimage, it can be a personal connection with a specific monument or a specific religion. Many people, especially in I used to live in Brazil, Afro-Brazilian religions and others, they believe we can connect to the spirits of the dead and they can help us. So a cemetery is a place where the spirit of the dead can really be present and help you. So in some cases, the cemetery, the place of the dead, becomes the place of the cure, the place of the healing, the place of the hope. Death can be a powerful ally in improving the quality of life of people. Especially, if I can say, in countries where you have no easy access to health, where you have to pay to see a doctor, where you have to pay to see a nurse. Sometimes religion can be your best option, and cemeteries can become places of cure, places of healing.
So you obviously have your own view of what the role of cemeteries is, and I think it's very interesting. But how do you feel about the stereotypes that we have about cemeteries?
I think that it's okay. By the way, I grew up watching American horror movies.
Night of the Living Dead?
Absolutely, one of my favorites, George Romero. So I know...
They never explained how they got out of the graves and onto the surface, but...
They don't, but people still believe it can happen.
So you can't explain that to us first?
No, I can't.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
I can't. And I spent a lot of time in cemeteries.
Okay, you've thought about it, okay.
So I know that, for example, the media have been important in spreading some sort of bad stereotypes about cemeteries. This is why I'm so grateful to be here today, because I also believe the media can be important in changing the way we look at cemeteries. So I like horror movies, I like horror novels. Edgar Allan Poe is my favorite American writer.
I'm not surprised.
But at the same time, let's not stop there. Cemeteries can be much more than just the dark side of the city. And by the way, dark, it doesn't necessarily mean scary. Dark can be mysterious, fascinating, challenging, interesting. So yeah, part of my job, it's not a job, part of my activity is changing the way people look at cemeteries.
So do you think it should be perfectly okay for a family to go there and spread out a blanket and have a picnic in a cemetery like they're in a park? Is that disrespectful, or do you think that's
Again,
it's a good use.
As a cultural anthropologist, the idea of right and wrong, respectful and disrespectful is very much cultural. In several societies, it's okay to have this kind of relationship with the dead and cemeteries. I know in other places, if I will go and picnic in a cemetery in Italy, in my birthplace, people will think bad things about me. I'm disrespecting the place. I believe that depending on the context and depending on the communities and depending on the work we do, we can be able to combine the respect we owe to the dead and the opportunity for the living people to take advantage of cemeteries in order to improve the quality of their lives.
Now, we talked about the class you're teaching on the Chicago cemeteries, but you're also teaching another class.
Yes.
The other one is what?
It's a class I teach for the Honors College at UAC on cemeteries and funerary art. Yeah.
And what is that? What do you talk about in that?
I make my students travel in time and space. We travel from ancient Greece to Argentina, from Brazil to Japan, from Italy to France, and back to the US, exploring how different cultures think about cemeteries, the way they build monuments or not in cemeteries, and what kind of artistic forms are used in these cemeteries, which materials, from Carrara marble, which is very famous, to bronze, monuments representing, for example, angels, crosses, to monuments celebrating different kind of beliefs. So it's a class many students like to take because it's really a way to travel, staying in Chicago and exploring cities and societies by analyzing cemeteries.
I know a lot of the sculpture we see in museums came from ancient cemeteries.
Absolutely. People often do not realize how often we are facing funerary art. When you visit the pyramids in Egypt, you visit tombs. When you go to India and you visit the beautiful Taj Mahal,
it's a tomb.
It's a tomb. So we should not be worried about connecting tourism with cemeteries.
There's one of the most striking pieces of art I've ever seen is in the National Museum in Athens, and it's from a grave. It was a statue, and it's this soldier at the moment of death, and he's got his sword raised, and it's on a steel, and he's got his sword raised, and it's just at the moment of death, and you can see it in his face. They really captured that transitory, elusive moment, and I can't imagine what it must have been like to go through these cemeteries in ancient times when they were giving them that much attention and they were putting their best artwork there. Of course, you're saying that that's true in Chicago as well, to some extent, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mostly in the late 1800s, though. I mean, do you feel like the statuary is still as interesting as it was back then? Are we still putting that much attention on it?
We probably don't, for several reasons. Most of the cemeteries we can visit today in the US, they were built in the second half of the 19th century. So yes, between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th is probably the moment artists had the most money and the most freedom to produce art. Today, for several reasons, maybe people don't want to invest that lot of money. Cremation changes things.
Well, of course,
Because when you have just an urn, you don't need a big monument. And also the materials became more expensive than they used to be. Think about marble, even bronze. So it was already a kind of a wealthy option to have a monument. Today, it's even more complicated to find a good artist and to pay for a beautiful big monument.
Do they still occasionally build those structures, those little mausoleums that you see in some of the old cemeteries? Is that still going on?
They do, but sometimes, especially in Europe, where you have ancient mausoleums and all the members of the family are gone, so you have these beautiful mausoleums which are kind of falling down. The cemeteries, the cities try to sell these old mausoleums to families who pay to restore the monuments, and so they
can reuse them?
Exactly.
That's terrible.
There is a ceremony. You take the ashes to the common ossuarium, and then they resell the plot also because funerary space is an issue in several cities.
Yeah.
In Italy, we are facing the lack of funerary space. Many cemeteries are crowded. In some countries or cities, think about Japan, Singapore, cremation is mandatory because there is no space left for the dead. So this is an issue we are going to face. Maybe not in the US, we have a lot of space, but we are running out of space, and also traditional burial, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of material. So a lot of people are choosing for more ecological approaches, natural burials. You have your body just involved in a shroud and put under a tree in a forest, and this has less impact on the planet, for example.
Very interesting. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Michaelangelo Giampaoli for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.